Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are thrilled to welcome you to our Real Issues and Real Data session on data breaches and data privacy. So we are here today to talk about, in a world where it's becoming increasingly common for data breaches to happen, what can we do to protect our data privacy and minimize the risk of exposure? So we're going to explore that today in our session this afternoon. Excited to be joined by some colleagues here at the Friday Institute. If you're not familiar with us, we are part of the College of Education at NC State. Amir, if you can go to the next slide for me, please. And what I love about my job is we get to think about the research, policy, and practice pieces of it. And so we're really thinking about it from those different perspectives, using those lenses to understand how we live and how we work and how we have an impact on students and the K-12 education space. I really love how Dr. Jose Picard describes what our work looks like here at the Friday Institute. We're thinking about how can we empower teachers and students? What does that look like with our research, with our practice, and with our policy? How can we empower folks to be more successful in what they do in a really positive and meaningful way? And then another one of my colleagues here, Dr. Callie Edwards, she speaks about those intersections of those three things, the research, the policy, and the practice, how we can explore using research different pathways to envision a new reality for where we're living. And so I really find it appropriate for us as we approach this topic this afternoon, and we're thinking about, in a world where we have these data breaches happening, how can we protect ourselves and what does that look like? How do we address these questions? And so my two colleagues at the Friday Institute, Sammy Carter and Amir Lawrence, have joined me this afternoon to dig into the details for what this looks like. They are part of our tech infrastructure lab at the Friday Institute and do amazing work with from the state level to the school building around cybersecurity and data protection in our spaces. And so want to welcome them and thank them for sharing their leadership and expertise with us today. To set the stage for us as we're thinking about what this looks like, though, look at some of the numbers here that are posted on the screen. Over 10,600 confirmed data breaches across all of the industries in the last year. And if we think about that, that's an increase of over, I think, 105%. Stolen credentials then are usually where those data breaches initiate. Around 40% start with a stolen credential. And the purpose for this for a lot of folks is because they are seeking some type of financial gain. Those threat actors or bad actors in this space are really thinking about how they can profit from that. So as we are exploring that topic this afternoon, our agenda really is designed to do some quick introductions and explanations of our work related to data breaches and data privacy, and then dig into some examples and demonstrations from open source intelligence and some countermeasures that we can explore. Of course, opportunity for us to have some Q&A with our experts as well. So please use that Q&A feature that's built into Zoom, and we'll be able to respond to your questions that way. So again, Amir and Sammy, thank you so much for joining us. Love to start with this question. What is the data breach? We hear about it all of the time. Why is it becoming such a common occurrence for us?
Okay, cool. So thank you, Emma, for the introduction. And yeah, that's a great question. I know it can be a bit confusing and concerning when you see like the headlines of these data breaches occurring. You're not really sure what that means when you really break it down. In the simplest of terms, a data breach can really just be described as bad actors gaining unauthorized access to data or just information in general via a bunch of different ways. On the screen, we have a couple examples, social engineering, malicious insiders, faulty controls, or hacking. And when we say even hacking, that's more of a catch-all term of sorts. Hacking in itself isn't one thing. It could be something based on like networking, for example. And it's really just a comprehensive result of a lot of different things that kind of stack up over time. And if you want to take a more personal look at some recent data breaches that have happened in the news, right? I'm sure we all remember the big social security number breach that happened a few months ago, right, with the National Public Data. Or you have the one from Comcast, where I think it was about 250,000 subscribers got their data stolen from a debt collector. And then finally, right here, we have the big settlement with T-Mobile, 31.5 million dollars, right? And I want to focus on this settlement because a big thing you want to think about here is that data is money in itself, right? Data is a currency. So when the cyber criminals are kind of gaining this data, they use it for to trade, sell, or just to exploit for just various financial gains or other malicious purposes, right? So when you look at things like monetization, ransomware, I'm sure is a familiar term for a lot of you, exploitation, or even just espionage, for thinking about more from like the nation state perspective. There's a wide array of uses of data as that currency. And then on the right side of the screen here, we just have some examples of what this data really means, right? So it's your PII, any information that can personally identify you. You have your financial details, medical records, IP if you're more so in like a business, and just general corporate secrets. So it's a very wide range of reasons and use cases for this data. So you kind of see the weight behind it and why it's such a sought after commodity in the world today.
Yeah, just to chime in on that a little bit,
Hmm.
Amir. So, those examples that you gave were great because they're big, heavy hitters that have happened very recently.
Hmm.
Those are three examples within the last couple of weeks. On any given day, I
Yeah.
get, a dozen
Yeah.
of different things. Most people don't see it unless it's something really big, but every single day there are data breaches.
Hmm.
The one that came across my head, we were talking about this
Yeah,
morning, that came
exactly.
across my inbox this morning was the Pokemon stuff. Now
Hmm.
I don't know anything about Pokemon, but the parent
The developer, Game
the
Freak.
developer Game Freak had a
Yeah.
breach, and that was just announced this morning.
Yeah.
Um, MoneyGram came out a couple days ago. So anybody that sort of transfers that money, that
Hmm.
was one that came out that we didn't have in our list.
Yeah.
The list just goes
Hmm.
on and on. And when we think about data currency, you kind of highlighted the point about cyber criminals.
Hmm.
There's this sort of financial gain
Yeah.
for malicious purposes. What I might suggest is that normal businesses and corporations actually operate in a very similar manner.
Hmm.
So when you think about, what is Google's business
Business
model,
model. Yeah.
they're not trying to do any type of kind of espionage type of thing, but you know, their data is or their business is data about people.
Hmm.
And so, it's just for different, if it's a different purpose. Because all businesses operate and feed on this kind of data stuff. So just want to kind of point that out and say that it's not a whole lot different from the cyber criminal side, that how they use data, but businesses also have a use for it as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Sammy. So, and kind of just building off of that idea, like really what's happening with this stolen data specifically, right? Typically, once it's breached, this data is going to be sold on the dark web, on a marketplace, right? I'm sure we're all familiar with that kind of word. You see it in the headlines all the time. But along with just being sold on these marketplaces, it's also just posted for free. Your data is just being essentially dropped off by these hackers for hacktivism, right? Just to gain attention or to gain notoriety. There could be a lot of interpersonal ways that's developing. And once this happens, once this disclosure does happen, it's almost impossible to actually remove or control this data. So it's like you can't get the toothpaste back in the tube once it's out. So it's just really important to try to be as proactive as possible, because if you have a reactive mindset of handling these data breaches and protecting your data, you're going to end up with a lot of disclosure that you just can't turn around. And what we have here on the screen is actually an example of one of the dark web forms that exists, right? The dark web is not this nebulous beast. It's an internet like we're all familiar with. This looks like a very typical form if any of you are familiar with something like Reddit, for example. And you can kind of see if you look closely here, these are just typical forms like services. But then if you look at the leaks at the very top, right, they talk about like databases, Stealer logs, specifically just cracked accounts, right? And then if you look at the actual form posts themselves, you'll see mentions of things like Office 365, right? Hotmail. And these aren't small breaches. These are all like 900,000 different like logins and accounts for certain websites. So it's really hard to overstate just how profitable and large this sort of economy is, right? And as I mentioned in the beginning, 105% increase. And as Sammy, I'm sure, can attest to, this is like a record year for data breaches in this economy kind of as a whole.
Yeah, I think political and sort of everything going on in the
Mhm.
world is driving a lot of this. But just to reiterate something you said earlier, you gave those three examples that says, hey, there was a breach with the National Public Database
Mhm.
and the Comcast stuff. I can tell you 100% that that data is sitting on this form. We pulled this screenshot yesterday,
Yeah.
and those data, those dumps are inside of this. So whenever those breaches happen, um, in this particular case, those three ended up on this specific form. There are many forms. This is why it says example. There are many of these, but
Mhm.
we get stuff. One of the things we do at the Friday Institute as part of our support for the K-12 cybersecurity program in North Carolina is we constantly monitor this
Mhm.
thing, and we're looking for um, compromised credentials, account
Mhm.
systems that may belong to any of our K-12 constituents. That combo list there is a particular one that we focus on. When you go in there, it'll be a bunch of text files
Mhm.
that have combo means username, password list.
Mhm.
Many times the username is the email. And so we go through those and we look for anything that's at a PSU in North Carolina.
Mhm.
And so, we monitor this,
Yeah.
but this is where that data ends up once it gets breached in many cases. Sometimes it's up for sale, sometimes it's just dumped there, like, hey, look what I did. But this is sort of one example of the end state of a breach.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And we'll get into it later, but I think a key part of this is what is the data not even say in itself, but what can it allude to if you are a smart actor and you kind of know how to kind of pivot through these different data points across the internet.
So that's really interesting how it's a complex and layered thing. Lots of motivation for folks to be stealing the data or using the data that we have. And I often hear as a solution, well, we just need to have data privacy. And it's a term that we throw around, we talk about, but I think it'd be really valuable to understand what does it mean when we say data privacy. So if you
Mhm.
could share a little bit about your perspective and help us understand that, it would be really important for us.
Yeah, yeah, of course. So, starting with the formal definition, obviously, kind of what is the actual like documentation say, right? Data privacy should just be the idea that the right of a party to maintain control over and confidentially of information about itself, right? And this comes from NIST, the NIST glossary. But informally, right, in a layman's term, it just means that you have control over your personal information, how it's handled, and deciding who gets to see and or use it, right? And one thing I really want to highlight here is in that formal definition, it mentions this thing, confidentiality. And I'm sure you might see it used interchangeably with data privacy, but that's not the case, right? Confidentiality is a very specific term from like the CIA triad, right? It's the technical way that we enforce or achieve data privacy, not really it's not the idea itself, it's really a technical mechanism.
Yeah. So, for example, on that, this is a very important point to make when it
Mhm.
comes to confidentiality and privacy. So when we think of privacy, we think, hey, I'm providing my data to this organization app system, and only certain people should be able to
Mhm.
see and access my information. So being able to know what information is provided and be able to see and have some say so over that
Mhm.
is about privacy.
Yeah.
How we actually control who can see and do and touch things and how it's stored is confidentiality. Think of authentication, access
Mhm.
control, encryption. These are the technical mechanisms we use to achieve or enforce sort of data privacy um, policies. So just want to kind of split that here because those
Mhm.
terms get used back and forth. I'm like, all right, well, which one do you mean when you
Yeah.
say, I got breached or my privacy was
Mhm.
violated? What exactly does that mean? So hopefully that helps clarify that a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you. So when we take this look at like data privacy, there are different ways when we're just online in general where this kind of comes into effect, right? When you are, and anyone who's online, you have to use various applications. And really to like split that here, when we say applications, we're not only referring to like an app on your phone, right? Application can refer to a web application, any sort of software, just platform in general. So we want to make sure that we are aware this is a very large scope of software that we're talking about here. But when to use any of these sort of platforms, you have to give up some information to register usually to get like the full functionality, right? That'll be your name, your email, phone number, address, etc. The things that are kind of pretty bog standard in any sort of user registration form. But in addition to that, this information can also be imported from other systems, right? So if you have some sort of third-party application, let's say you're doing some online shopping, right? It might kind of pull your information from wherever like Google Pay may have, or at some different education portals if you're logging into like a school system, things like that. And it's just important to understand that there's various documentation out there as well that outlines how you can not only interact with that platform, but how they can also interact with your data. So that's what we're really going to be focusing on here to kind of give you a bit more of insight to what's really available at your disposal when you think of the price of being online. Specifically, we want to look at four relatively familiar terms, right? Terms and conditions, permissions, privacy policies, and cookies. And we'll go into a bit more detail of not only like those specific items, but also sort of the background behind them. And when we mean that, we're looking at the different laws, policies, and guidance that are actually sort of the spurs to make these more like requirements for online platforms to have, right? And it's a long history. We won't really go too in depth with these. You can do more. We have some resources available if you're interested. But at a high level, right, you have the U.S. Privacy Act of 1974. This was sort of the grandfather of a lot of these different policies and guidances. Then you have the e-privacy directive, which is from the UK. That's the one that kind of enforces things like the cookies pop up when you're online. Then you have the GDPR, and this was really the big one. And it essentially mandated certain cybersecurity or data privacy kind of requirements for any platform or business that was taking in UK user data. And then the same thing for the California Consumer Privacy Act, the Virginia Privacy Act, or the North Carolina Privacy Act. And I think what's really interesting about these policies and guidances is that there's no sort of universal mandate. It's just they can say for our state or for the UK, you have to do X, Y, and Z. But since the world is so online and everyone's so interconnected, you won't really see a company only make an app just for one specific state or make an instance for one specific state. So a lot of these requirements become essentially like pseudo mandates just because it makes it a lot easier for those companies to operate more holistically.
So a little bit more on this. The GDPR is sort of out of the EU. It was the first large scale, like multiple countries, big region that talks about privacy, and it's got some pretty big teeth associated with it. There's been push to have something like that in the US. But in lack of having a national one, what we're seeing is each individual state, it's like, hey, well, if you're not going to create one, then we'll create one. So each one of these is popping up. So the the California one was first, then Virginia. Here comes North Carolina, and there's many other ones that bits and pieces of it, and you're going to see more and more individual states until the US decides. In contrast, there are national standards and requirements around like encryption, access control, the more the cybersecurity side of things. But there's not a national mandate or any platform for data privacy. Every organization has something. That's why we say select laws, policies, and guidance. Everybody's got
something
thoughts about this. This is just here's 6 of the 600 that exist. We provide in one of our resources, there's a link to the North Carolina Department of Information Technology website. I know there may be some folks not from North Carolina on our session here, but those talk specifically about some of the guidance and rules and regulations and policies specific to North Carolina. What are our reporting requirements? What are our, what are the rules around North Carolina reporting it? So if you say, I want to make a public records request, well, what are the rules? What qualifies as that type of thing? And that all kind of falls into this as it relates to privacy. So there's many, many things. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
So getting a bit deeper into the actual privacy mechanisms themselves, let's start with probably the most familiar one, right? The terms and conditions. I'm sure everyone's seen them. We've all kind of just scrolled through them and click the accept button at the end because this is the easiest thing to do, right? And when you really look at what they're doing or their goal of the terms and conditions, it's just to explain how you can really interact with an app or in a service. There's no legal requirement for it to have it. It's just more in the company's best interest to have this here to protect themselves. And it can include some privacy related information, but it typically just links to the actual privacy policy in itself, its own document. What we can see in the screenshot here, this is just the one from Facebook, Meta. I'm sure this is something that we're all familiar with or engaged with in some way. And you'll see through the examples here, just various types of privacy policies and things like that. So moving on to these policies specifically, these will actually outline how the app will interact with your data specifically. And this is going to be what's required by things like the NCCPA, the CalOPA, the GDPR, for example. And these, again, aren't asking your permission for anything. It's just informing you of what they're doing with your data. And that can be a bit of a contentious point because with the naming of privacy policy, you assume it's dealing with the policies to protect and maintain privacy over your data, but that's really not the case at all. And one thing I also think is really important to highlight here is a lot of this data, it's typically covered in legalese. It's very, very thorough. It's hard for a regular person who's not familiar with this sort of verbiage or this terminology to understand what they're really saying here. And that's going to be something we're going to just kind of highlight as we go through this presentation as well. Taking a step to the more like I guess niche side with your permissions, right? This is you'll typically see it on mobile apps, but also on some web apps, right? Though this is where they're actually asking explicitly, okay, what can I do and what data can I grab, right? So it's a mixture of functionality, user experience, and security when they're asking for these permissions. Depending on the app, they may actually make this a bit more blatant, or otherwise it'll be a bit more gray and granular. And that's just because these requests typically extend past their required scope and are just a bit vague in general, right? And there's no universal solution to how to like be a bit more, I guess, secure when it comes to these permissions, but it's just things to look out for and make sure you're not just accepting these permissions sort of blindly just to kind of get access to the service. And I really want to highlight with this example here from Microsoft, right? This is for a Telmar Forms printer, but it's asking to get full access to your inbox, which I mean, at a service level could seem like a good decision to make, but in reality, if it's a printer, it would just need access to that one file that you're trying to print, not your full inbox. And that's like even going back to everything you've had in the past as well. So just something to look out for. And there's a lot of examples of these where you'll have certain apps like a camera app or maybe a fitness app, but it needs access to all of your contacts, your messages, your microphone. And you have to kind of wonder what's happening with all this data. Why are they using it? How does this benefit my use of this one specific tool?
I want to bring something, if you kind of squint and look
Mhm.
at the bottom, you're talking about terms and conditions, privacy policies. We're
Mhm.
talking about them sort of as these silo
Mhm.
kind of components, but they're all very interrelated
Mhm.
and they're kind of connected at the
At the
hip.
hip. Yeah.
If you look at this specific example that you provided here,
Mhm.
it says accepting these permissions means that you allow this app to use your data as specified in the terms of service, terms and
Yep.
conditions, and privacy statement. So it's showing you how you're giving me access to
Mhm.
do all the things that I told you I was gonna do over here in this
Mhm.
language that you don't understand
Yeah.
because we had the lawyers write it.
Exactly. And I think another cool thing, like just a small nuance too, is there's no really set standard for how these are actually just even named, right? It could be terms and conditions, it could be terms of service, it could be privacy statement, privacy policy. And again, if you're not really kind of savvy or up to date on what these things really are and what they entail, you might be that confusion is enough wiggle room for you to be taken advantage of if you're not really kind of on the ball looking for these things 24/7. And just finally, let's take a look at cookies, the little pop-up at the bottom of your screen. These are just more so there are many different types of cookies, right? It depends on things like the duration, first or third party, different purpose. So it's a very broad category. In essence, cookies are just kind of allow the website or the application using to store data per session, depending on the duration about your instance and kind of the choices you're making. And this pop-up is pretty simple, right? It just says this website stores cookies on your computer. They're used to collect information about how you interact with our website. And then you can either decline, accept, or there's this little cookie settings. And this was just on one of the websites that I actually was using a part of my research, right? And when you kind of go a bit deeper, the demo is, or this example actually lets you break it down by the necessary cookies, the analytic cookies, or the advertisement cookies, right? So thankfully, due to the e-privacy directive, this sort of pop-up is required. But it's important really because of the marketing cookies. That's what we really think of when we say like look out for cookies, because there are going to be some necessary cookies. Even if you say you don't want to have any, there has to be a single cookie on your kind of system to at least say, hey, they don't want us to add any more. So there's going to be something there to just run the bare bones of the website. But the real kind of malicious ones are those marketing cookies, right? And those are typically cookies that are not even added by the website you're visiting, usually some sort of third-party advertiser. They're persistent, which means they kind of stay in that cache until you delete them, and they just are mining so much data about you that it's a bit surprising when you really get down to what they're pulling from you and how they're using it. And you gotta think, where is that data then, going? And that really takes us over to kind of this idea of a purple unicorn. We say data privacy, right? What does that mean in the world where we have cookies and privacy policies and terms and conditions? Are these mechanisms in place really gonna protect us and stop the data breaches that Emma talks about? Are we gonna be all safe and happy? And I think Sammy could really add some points here.
Yeah, you shouldn't have set me up like that. I it's weird. You have a cybersecurity person who, we were kind of in preparation for this. I said, I just need to make it very clear. I don't believe in data privacy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little bit of a loaded statement, but I don't, in all of my presentations and work, I very rarely do much on this particular side of cybersecurity. I'm always on the encryption, access control, those types of mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
I just struggle with the general concept of it. For example, if we kind of use some of the things you just described,
Mm-hmm.
you install an app or you're going to go buy something or get some free thing online and you have to accept these terms and conditions and privacies. What you're doing is you're accepting it at that point in time based on what it says. It is written in these weird terms that make it sound like how they're doing everything so good for you. But in fact, if you can sort of, get a lawyer to sit down with you and interpret this nonsense, it describes about how they're doing it. So, they're disclosing that I'm going to take your data and run with it and do all kinds of stuff, but they say it in the nicest way, like, oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
The other thing is, as I mentioned, that's at a point in time. Every time an app platform, whatever, adds some new bell or whistle, I want to go get the new
Emoji or
I want to
something.
get the purple poop emoji, then they're going to add a new feature to it, which requires them to notify you. So whenever you get an email that says, oh, we've updated our terms and conditions because we care about your privacy.
Yeah.
You just added a new feature and function and you had to tell me about it, and it's buried in something that tells me that you've now turned this on. Let me give you a very specific example. It just happened recently. LinkedIn. I am on LinkedIn, my professional profile. Most people have one of those. Everybody loves them some AI. So LinkedIn is like, oh, we are going to incorporate AI into our platform. Okay. And so, because we want to help our customers. Well, when they sent that out very deep in that little message, it says, oh, we had to update our terms and conditions. Well, the reason they had to do that is when you go into your LinkedIn settings, everybody who has a LinkedIn profile can check this. Go into your settings and you'll see a new thing. Oh, we've added AI capabilities. Well, that sucker is turned on by default. And they let you know that in those terms and conditions, but it's been slurping your profile and data to train its AI model out of that. And so that's the kind of thing, there's a new feature. In this case, you actually have the ability to say, don't do that, but you didn't get to say that before they slurped your data out. So it's, just as an example, it's in trying to stay on top of all this stuff for the thousands of apps and systems that you use. Many times when you are going through those terms and conditions or privacy policies, it's kind of an all or nothing. You say, well, hey, I'm going to send your data to this third-party group for marketing and research purposes. Well, no, I don't want you to do that. Well, you don't get a choice. Don't use the app. And you're constantly having to make these decisions between kind of privacy and usability. I don't, this is where I really, really struggle with this concept of privacy, because people say that, oh, you just, you expose my email address, but yet you will turn around and tell everything about you and everything you just did on Facebook.
Mhm.
And so people disclose a lot of information about themselves, even without all the trickery that happens with these terms and conditions and privacy policies. There's really no way to kind of stay on top of that stuff. And people are their own worst enemy here. They want to get the latest bell and whistle, the latest free thing, and you're
Mhm.
willing to give up a ton of stuff to do it.
Mhm.
I just it just doesn't feel realistic. I love
Mhm.
the purple unicorn there because I don't see how you can achieve data privacy. To me, it's not achievable. It's
Mhm.
not realistic to assume that that's going to fix everything. But we got 5,000 laws and chief data privacy officers and all these people that are supposed to keep track of all this stuff that is impossible to do. It just I don't get it. So it doesn't make sense to me. I don't think there's such thing as data privacy.
Yeah, and I think all that stuff that Sammy
Yeah.
says.
Now that uplifting speech I
No, yeah, but I
gave.
mean, it's the like you said, it's the reality of it. You can't look at it from this kind of rose-tinted lens idea, and I think it really boils down and sort of like the crux of what we're trying to get at here is that if something is free, then you are the product, right? So you gotta think like Sammy mentions about these different companies when they're providing you all these services for free, no charge, and yeah, they might run a few ads here, but thinking from the grand scale, what's Google's business model? Like, how are they really making their money if Google Drive is free, Google Sheets is free, Google Docs is free? The money has to come from the data. And like we mentioned, the data is the currency. So it may seem at face value very kind of benevolent of these companies to protect our data, but they're really just sort of making the perfect machine to funnel it. So it's your job as the user, as the consumer, to protect yourself and kind of find different ways to at least disrupt this data pattern. Because as you'll see, there's a whole sort of economy ecosystem world that's built on leveraging not only the data that you're giving up to these companies, but also the data that's kind of just sitting there for free, just
Yeah.
by being somebody who's alive in today's
Yeah.
world.
Another example to that, how many people have some type of Fitbit or an Apple Watch that's
Mhm.
monitoring all your health stuff? That just seems like, oh, I can monitor my heart rate and all this.
Yeah.
Where do you think that data is going? Don't you think that would be nice and prime and juicy for an insurance company to know
Exactly.
about that? Oh, he hasn't moved in off his couch in a week.
Yeah.
So,
Let's raise his premiums or something like
raises
that. Yeah.
premiums. I mean, you can see how that data can be used
Yeah.
out the back door. So when you talk about how we share your data, like who else are you sharing it with? And by the way, who are they sharing it with? And who are they sharing it with? It's like this never
Yeah.
ending chain of something that
Yeah.
you have no control
And
over.
this data is going
Yeah.
this data is
Yeah.
being, it's traveling, it's going places. So that's just something you want to think about,
Yeah.
like,
And
what's happening to your data.
and just to finish my soapbox, unless you are willing to not use this stuff and go live like
Mhm.
a hermit, you can't stop it.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, people say, well, oh, I don't like that this company is doing that. I'm like, well, you're going to stop using the app? Well, no. I'm like, all right, then
Yeah,
stop complaining about data privacy.
yeah.
Yeah. So I think then, since you've now burst the bubble of how we might be safe online and have data privacy, and the data is out there, where is it living? Where is it? How would we know what's out there? How do we take some power back by learning more about what the situation is?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think a good way to really think about this is just like the fact that the internet is bidirectional, right? So whatever kind of resources are available for the bad guys or for these corporations to kind of use your data, it's available for you to as well to protect yourself and protect your data, right? So that's where we're going to bring in this concept of OSINT or open source intelligence, right? And this really at its core the idea of collecting, analyzing, and disseminating information that is publicly available online from various open sources, right? So these threat actors that we described earlier on in the presentation, they use OSINT specifically to uncover sensitive information that they can then leverage to exploit just various vulnerabilities in technical systems as well as individuals, right? This is a very broad field. It can be for something as large as nation states and giant companies, but also to make profiles about specific individuals, right? So what we want to get at here is that this data that exists out there, this pool of controlled and uncontrolled data, it feeds into something like OSINT. Specifically, you can use it sort of, you can take the power back really and use OSINT as a tool on your own to gain awareness of the information that's available out there, to find out where that data actually is, and also just minimize the exposure and detect some of the reconnaissance activities we'll kind of go into in a bit here. And we just really want to drive from the idea that your goal should be to minimize the amount of personal and organizational information that's publicly available about you, right? So when you think about how do you do this, you have to kind of think like the attackers think. So first you want to understand, okay, well, what's the data? What's the different types of data? So as I mentioned, you have this idea of controlled and non-controlled data. And we really want to drive this point home because most people might not think about it like this, but there are two sort of categories, right? For the controlled data, it's going to be the things that we talked about earlier that you specifically are able to actively manage and protect to ensure this like sort of CIA in your own right. And that's going to be the things that are, you would hope they're safeguarded through your terms and conditions and your cybersecurity policies. And that'll be just sensitive data, your personal details, academic records, health information, etc. But on the other side of the fence, there is just non-controlled data. It's not like subjected to any strict protection measures. It's often public information. So like voter registration information, for example, general business data, website content. If you're on social media, 9 times out of 10, that's just uncontrolled data. It's just posted for anyone to see, unless you're a bit more strict with your kind of access rights, right? And even though this data is not considered sensitive, it's super, super critical in OSINT because it allows you to really pivot between data points and build this sort of profile that we're describing here. So when we take a step back, a slight pivot to thinking about really, okay, well, how do the attackers use this controlled and non-controlled data to really build these profiles that we're describing and leverage OSINT? We want to start at the kind of the start of the cyber attack lifecycle, right? Specifically reconnaissance. And for those who aren't familiar with reconnaissance, it's just really the idea of information gathering or footprinting to just get as much information as possible before you really kind of make your attack if you're an attacker. And there are two different types. You have passive reconnaissance and active reconnaissance. Passives, we're going to be spending a lot of our time for the rest of this session because it's just more so gathering information without directly interacting with your target. You mainly use sort of intermediary services to kind of keep it a bit more anonymous, and it's really leveraging that public information. Now, at the end, we'll kind of tap on this a little bit, but there's also active reconnaissance, and that's the technical side. You're directly interacting with these systems to get information. You have to connect with the system, with the target most likely, and this is where you'll get like the really high value data, like credentials, configuration details, really critical PII, things like that.
So just to kind of pull this back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier, we talked about there's these things. So we talked about three different things here and how they all relate together. And we talked about we're as a user consumer, we're putting data into all these different applications or maybe things that we use at work or whatever. And sometimes things can go bad. I'm not pointing any specific fingers. There's a variety of reasons data breaches happen. But that data that is in these systems can sometimes be breached, as we gave some examples. Well, how can it be breached is often starting with what we're describing here, this cyber attack life cycle. I know that these people put this kind of data into these systems. If I can get my hands on that data, I can blackmail them, sell it. I can do all kinds of stuff that we outline with that data. How do I get into those systems and break into that? And it's using this. And we talked about passive versus active. So when we talk about active, I'm constantly engaging with the site. I'm going to set off alarms. I'm snooping around kind of thing. And it's going to be very obvious that I am there poking around and you're like, huh. And then, you can take some kind of actions. Passive is much more nefarious because I can get all this information about you and your organization and things to build my profile and to form my attack, and I never actually have to even get near you. So we generally go through as much passive as we can, and then if we have to, we'll do some active, but the goal is to get passive and then use that to then hit you without ever engaging with you before.
Yep.
Yeah, I think a good example of that happened today in our office where our executive director, it appeared that she had sent an email to folks that said, can you complete this task for me? And it was just a random email that appeared to look like she was sending us a message and it was just spam. So but maybe an overt way that someone was trying to interact with us to get information or get us to do something. Yeah.
No, but exactly that
Yeah.
kind of attack, that phishing attack, is what leads to this sort of gathering of extra
Yeah.
data, right? Because depending on who clicks on that information, that link or whatever it may have been, then they get to essentially spider web into, okay, well, what else does this person who fell for it, what do they have access to, and who can they reach? And it really sort of snowballs in on itself, right? And it's an interesting way, which I'm kind of going to talk about here with the OSINT Dojo pivoting, right? Specifically with the OSINT Dojo, it's a rich set of like OSINT resources, but the one we really want to focus on here is this idea of the attack surface diagrams, which I'll actually show you in detail here. So specifically what these attack surface diagrams are it's a small set of, let's say, various sort of data entryways, right? You have GitHub, Instagram, Skype, Twitter, and then LinkedIn, which is I'm sure what we're all familiar with. And what these attack surface diagrams do is it sort of explodes it out and shows you a map of, okay, let's say you only have someone's LinkedIn account, right? What information can you gather from that account? And then what are some different ways you can use it, right? So when you look at a LinkedIn account, you'll usually have some sort of contact information, which could give you a lot of information about that person more in a general sense. They will always have, let's say, some sort of they'll have some sort of URL, which is typically their username. They'll have some sort of photos there. You can pull a lot of interesting information from these data points here. And the idea is, let's say you see like their URL. Well, that would then tell you what their username is. So then if you see they have a username, then you can kind of look here and kind of trace, okay, well, what can I get here? What can I figure out? And it literally just helps make that mapping a lot easier. And this is a very useful tool to have when you're really trying to build that profile at a larger context, you know. So if we go back for to some tools but that specifically leverage this like sort of idea of pivoting around. The one big example is what's my name, right? So this tool is specifically meant to sort of, if you have somebody's username, let's say you use the dojo, you found out their username, then where do you go from there? Well, you would use something like this to then scrape the internet to see, okay, well, where is this username popping up?
Yeah.
So this is me just going to the website, and again, the cookies pop up. I have to accept or decline. And funny thing too is I can say, well, I don't know, this site seems a little sketchy. I don't want to accept it. Let me just decline and keep going. I don't have really any choice. I have to give them the consent for the cookies, but at least they told me that I had an
Just
option.
drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
drink it.
So here, I'll go ahead and put my my username here if Sam wants to add in while this is loading.
Yeah, while Amir's sort of getting staged up there, this is an interesting website because one of the things in cybersecurity we always preach is don't utilize your same password in multiple different places. And it's kind of related to this particular one here. So don't use your same password because if I can get your password to one site, the likelihood of you using that in another site is pretty high. Okay. So what Amir is doing here is, well, let me back up. So using that same foundation, don't use your username or don't use your password on more than one site, kind of rule of thumb. Well, most people think about, well, what about usernames? They don't think about it from that perspective. You know, how many of you have the same username in multiple different places, especially if it's like your email?
Yeah.
So Amir's got a site here that allows you to search for people's usernames and it gives you your list there.
Yeah.
Tell us
So essentially what like the username I put in, this was the username I had since I was, I think, 11 years old, right? I wasn't really cyber secure at that time. So I had a bunch of accounts on different like gaming websites like GameSpot, Congregate, Imager, YouTube, for example. And what this tool is basically doing is just going through and actually pulling, essentially doing like a web crawl and pulling any sort of instance of that account existing, right? And it's not 100% accurate. There's always going to be false positives because it's the internet. You're going to have duplicate usernames, especially if it's nothing really like unique. But I think what's interesting here is, let's say that I'm an attacker and I was on those dark web forums earlier that we discussed, and I have this list of data breaches, right? And I know, okay, well, there was a GameSpot breach back in, let's say, 2015. then I can say, well, if I know this person has this username and they had an account on this website and this account had a data breach, then I can take another kind of cybersecurity technique and go through and see if I can get a credential for that account and see if I can get some access there. And then let's see what information that account gives me. And you can kind of again begin to pivot and see, okay, well, do they post any personal information on this website? Do they post their address or their phone number or their email, anything like that? And you really get to see how this can sort of form this really, really detailed image of who a person was at a specific point in time, but also just in a general sense as well.
And kind of drill into that.
Mhm.
So if GameSpot, just as an
Yeah,
example, had
yeah.
a compromise, and as an attacker, I have your credentials.
Mhm.
Remember what I said earlier? Many people reuse the same credentials across
Exactly.
multiple sites. So then I can take those same credentials, punch in your username here, see what other profiles and websites and accounts you have, and I can
Mhm.
try those same credentials on each of these different ones.
Yep.
It's a common threat actor technique to do that, because we know that people reuse credentials.
Mhm.
It's a fact.
Yeah.
And so this is just one methodology that that can be used to sort of get more information about people. But it's a fun one.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. And then again, following this idea of, let's say like you're on somebody's LinkedIn, right? And they have a profile photo. Well, that photo, any photo online really, unless cleaned, has something called metadata. And if you're not familiar, metadata is really just some like essentially additional information that describes the data itself, right? It's data about the data. And it's baked into every digital camera there is with various pieces of data and information, and it can tell a lot about you that you might not know about. So it has a wide range of details, and it goes from these very basic, minute details of like, oh, what's like the camera size, or like what aperture do they have, or things like that, to very complex and descriptive information that could be a bit compromising, especially if you're unaware that it exists. So one of the tools we use that we see in the OSINT community is something called xif.tools. And what this does is you upload a multimedia file, and then it will extract all that metadata right on the website for you, and you can use that for whatever purposes you may see fit. So I'll go ahead and grab this if someone wants to add on while this is loading up.
So all digital files data has metadata. So just a very simple example. If you create a file, it's going to have a file name. It's going to have who created it. It's going to have how big the file is. You know, those pieces of data are not in the content or the body of the file. It's the metadata around it. And depending on what type of file data you have, some can have a little bit of metadata, some can have a lot. So what Amir just did here is he well, tell us how you got here.
Yeah, so
I kind of talked over what you were doing.
Oh no, yeah, you're good. So basically, I took a picture of my fiddle leaf fig at my apartment. And let's say in this context, my fiddle leaf fig. It's a plant.
Oh, okay.
So I took a picture of it at my apartment last night for the sake of the demo. But in, let's say, the context of the example, I can't take care of it anymore. I need to sell it. I want to find like a good home for it. So I post it on Facebook Marketplace or whatever kind of secondhand retail you may use. But I'm a bit hesitant if somebody found out like where I live. So I just say, oh well, let's just meet at the Walmart or the Lowe's, and we'll like trade it there. I don't want these random people kind of knowing where I stay at, right? But let's say they took this image and they just downloaded it off the internet, and they load it up into this file here or this tool here, and this is the kind of information they can get. And at first glance, it doesn't seem like anything too crazy. It tells you like around the time I took the photo, some really kind of technical mumbo jumbo about the camera and all this kind of stuff.
You have an iPhone 13.
Exactly. So then you get into, okay, well, what's it taking on? It's the iPhone 13. It gives you some information about the actual phone itself, and then it gives you the date and the time, and then some camera details. But if you keep scrolling past all the mumbo jumbo, you actually get at the very bottom here, GPS coordinates. So what this is and what this kind of shows is that every camera digital device, it's always kind of tracking your GPS location via satellite. So what you have here is then if you take this information here, and let's say you just go to Google Maps and then you drop it in here, that is roughly my apartment complex and like where I stay at. So me saying let's meet at the Lowe's 30 minutes away won't really do me any good, because anyone can sort of pull this up and get the area where I stay at. And a lot of people don't think about that, but look about it at the context of, yes, this is me selling something on Craigslist, but let's say you're on a family vacation somewhere, or you're posting things about like your kid at school and things like that, and you're posting them on Facebook. Most people aren't going to go through the time and effort to, okay, let me download this file, scrub it, re-upload it to sort of mask that. So you're really putting a lot of sensitive information about you and your family just out for anyone to see whenever you post something online. I think that kind of ties into the overall idea of social media, and like really, what are you putting out there on social media, and kind of how does it then trickle down into this kind of broader community of open source intelligence?
Yeah, and in many, like, if we just keep going with the camera example, inside of cameras on your phone or big cameras, that is actually a configurable option. You can turn that off. It is on by default in most cases, but you can turn it off. So I'm going to go back to my whole, data privacy is nonsense theme. How many people are willing to turn that feature off? Because I love it when I'm looking at an old picture. I'm like, where were we when we took that picture? It sure is nice when I can just look in the metadata and say, oh, we were in Myrtle Beach when we did that. That is very nice to see that. I appreciate that from a usability standpoint. And so I don't like that you can do this, but I also like that feature, that privacy versus usability
Exactly.
balance. You got to sort of make a decision on there.
And I think that also highlights a really good point, is that yes, we're cybersecurity experts, and yes, Sammy doesn't really believe in data privacy, but we're also humans. We are online. They're like, no, we're not like special beings. We're not above all of this. So it's a series of compromises that you have to make of, okay, well, how much of my privacy am I willing to sort of give up for this usability? How much am I willing to compromise to sort of like reap the benefits of being in an online world, even if it puts me at risk in some cases? And then looking at another demo, this is more for actually like essentially increasing your awareness, right? Google has a built-in feature called Google Alerts, where you can actually be alerted whenever whatever you type in here is actually put online. So if you go to this page here, google.com/alerts, you can essentially just create an alert about anything. For example, I have an alert here where if my email address, for example, is mentioned online, or if my name, my company, my position is ever mentioned online, you just get an email. And it may seem sort of superfluous at first, but if you're really trying to keep track of, okay, well, if someone posts on a dark website or any website, Amir Lawrence lives at the address and his phone number is this and this and this, you'd probably want to know where that is.
Well, I'm going to tell everybody you're the fig man now.
Yeah.
And I've got your GPS coordinates of your address.
Exactly.
So you might want to go ahead and add that alert.
Exactly. But we'll go into later ways that you could potentially protect yourself from stuff like that too.
So one other thing about this, you ever heard somebody use the phrase, oh, Google yourself? Well, that's kind of what this is. But the difference is it's constantly Googling whatever you type in there, and it will, today you may have, I'm just going to make up something. Let's say you had 100 results if you typed your name in Google. Well, something may show up tomorrow. And so instead of you having to do that every day,
it's constantly checking
you can just set up an alert. You can set it, you can put anything you would put in a Google search bar in here, and it'll alert you if something pops up. You can use this to all kinds of use cases, but like one of them, sometimes when we go to conferences, the conference comes out and you have to register for the hotel or it'll sell out. And I don't want to sit there and check the websites, every day. So I'll create a Google alert on that page and stuff, and it'll let me know when it popped up, and I can be one of the first to go in there and grab it.
There you go.
You can track your organization, you can track people. If you work for a school district and something showed up online, good or bad, about your thing, then you could go in here and create and monitor yourself, kind of thing. So having that awareness, if there was something good or bad that showed up online about you, it gives you a mechanism to track and monitor that. And since Google is nothing against the Bing people, but that's Google's kind of the big one there. If it doesn't know about it, probably is not out there.
Exactly. And kind of getting back to this idea of these search engines and kind of learning about yourself, there's also just people search engines out there. There's a whole suite of them. Again, everything we're showing you is like really the tip of the iceberg here. The one I want to focus on specifically is That's Them. and it's a people search engine where you can use a bunch of different criteria. But I don't mind being the guinea pig, and I think kind of following this idea of LinkedIn, right? As a student, I was told always put your resume on LinkedIn, have all the information publicly available, so like recruiters can find you, so you can get a job offer, for example. So let's say you looked at my LinkedIn and my resume, you saw that okay, my name is Amir Lawrence, but on it, my first job when I was 17 was in New Bern, North Carolina, right? So you just want to check, okay, let's see, Amir Lawrence, New Bern, NC, and let's see what pops up, search. And then what you gather here is that it has my name, it has my old residence,
And
it
there's that email you were
it
showing
has it
earlier.
has my email. So what's happening here is that this site is taking from some data breaches. We're not really sure which ones. Obviously, they don't disclose that, and they sort of build a very small profile based on you that anyone can see. And depending on how many breaches you've been in, or if you just pay for their full background check, you can get a really quick and easy profile. So I think what this really hones in on is that these services are not hard to use. It's if anything, it's a money barrier. Like data is currency. So if you have the money and the time, it'd be really easy to get a full profile on anybody that you've really ever met if they've been in these data breaches. Um, but I think one interesting thing too is that since they rely on these breaches, if you use some certain tools that can actually pull this information from the breaches, then these tools actually won't work on you. Kind of become not impervious, but at least protected in the meantime. And then moving on to our next demo. This is actually an interesting case because we're actually going to demo something called the Wayback Machine, which if you aren't familiar with, it's really an internet archive. So it just crawls the internet and takes a screenshot of every like web page that you can think of, and it has it right there on the page for you to see, right? So if you want to see like what this website looked like back in like 2005, what did old YouTube look like, things of that nature. But while we were actually doing research for this presentation, they also had a very, very large data breach. So it kind of threw a wrench on our plans, but I think it's a kind of goes back to Sammy's point. No one's really safe. These things are happening literally every day, and it's kind of insane because the Internet Archive, especially when you think about legacy information, the Internet Archive is it's really used for good. It's used to keep a log of what the internet has been and will be. And think about like if Wikipedia gets breached, what happens to those like terabytes of data that just exist that log our history, right? So currently, or at least as of a few days ago, this is what the page looks like. It wasn't really available. You just kind of got stopped there. So we reverted to the bit more sketchy cousin of Wayback Machine. We have archive.is. We recommend using it with caution. But it does the same focus, right? If you want to look at like,
Next one.
oh yeah, here you go. If you want to do like what does YouTube look like back then you can do a search, it'll do its thing, and then it just pops up a bunch of these old like screenshots of what YouTube looks like from back in the day. And the real use case of this is, let's say, you have all these companies and they're cybersecure now. Were they really cybersecure back in like 2010, 2007? What information was on those websites? Well, with a tool like this, and if you kind of know how to do your searches right, you can find like the old company page and let's see, okay, well, whose PII did they have up there, right? I know one thing that always blew my mind is like for NC State, I think, or for a lot of universities, like the social security number was the user ID or like the student ID.
Yeah.
So let's say you had a student directory that was online back then, and that person's SSN was their student ID. You could theoretically find it using a tool like this to get that screenshot and then kind of go down that rabbit hole with that information.
Yeah.
So
So thank you so much for sharing all of these various tools and resources. It's so important, I think, to be informed about what other people are doing, what you can do and find out yourself. I know because our time is running short here, you have a variety of different resources that you can share with folks. We will also post links to these on our page, our website, and share that out from the list of folks who registered for this webinar. So if there are links in this slide deck that you weren't able to capture from the chat, we will definitely be posting those and sharing those with folks. So I know that you just want to briefly mention there's an OSINT framework, there's Intel techniques, and there's awesome OSINT as well. If you could just give us a quick 30-second rundown of briefly, that would be great.
Yeah, so the idea behind these extra resources is what we described is really, like I mentioned, the tip of the iceberg. We talked about the passive reconnaissance and really high level, more sort of like reconnaissance level things. But OSINT is so much more than that. It's very, very technical if you want it to be. So using something like the open source intelligence framework or the awesome OSINT, these will give you actual technical resources and skills and like things you can use to really dive deeper and see the more, I guess, hacking side of it, if you want to think about it like that. And we just wanted to
Yeah.
make that available for those who were interested. But we know that this side can be very intimidating, so we didn't want to focus too much on that today in the presentation.
We gave 4 demos
Yeah.
and with 4 tools. Well, there are hundreds that
Yeah.
we didn't talk about that kind of do similar things to get different information.
Mhm.
And these are just kind of a curated list of those things.
Yeah.
So what are some of your suggestions then for countermeasures? What do we do? How do we take some of our control back?
Yeah, so even though, Sammy sort of burst the bubble on the mysticism of data privacy, there's still stuff you can do to protect yourself. It's just not as of a perfect solution as like companies may want you to think, right? You can always make sure you educate yourself on these terms and conditions or the privacy policies or permissions or just anything that you're accepting. It's very easy to just kind of scroll through and blindly click, but there are a lot of free tools available out there to actually go through and at least to some degree translate them for you, or at least give you the high level of what they're pulling and what you're accepting. But even in that regard, you want to just make sure that you are super, super skeptical, especially with these permissions, right? If you're downloading like Candy Crush, they don't need access to your contacts and your microphone and your camera and your GPS, right? Be skeptical, be a bit more conservative with what you allow these tools to use and to have access to. And then when it's just like public information, really limit what you share online, limit the photos you share, limit the sort of the more personal details if possible. It's just, we know it's hard to do when you're on an online world, but you don't want to make it super easy for this data pattern to sort of digest you and kind of get you in this loop and really leverage all the paid and free tools, right? It's an economy on both sides. It's an economy for those trying to use your data and cannibalize it and sort of profit off of it. And it's also an economy for these companies who can provide services to help protect yourself and disrupt this pattern. And that's kind of what we have here. This is again a very, very small list. There's a lot more in the facilitation guide that we have. But for some examples here, you have E-Verify, where you're able to actually just lock your social security number so that it can't be used for like background checks or credit checks. A lot of companies do offer various services where you can actually delete your account and your data from various like companies. There's some paid solutions that work very well that I think Sammy could talk about in a second. And then also you have things like the Google results about you, which is similar to the alerts where it's just finding your personal information. And this time you actually get Google to remove it for you. And then moving on to the free side, Sam, when you talk about something like Incogni and kind of what you've seen with that.
Yeah, so I I actually my personal account, I've been hearing about all these things. Oh, we can remove your stuff off the internet and off these websites that where I know all my stuff is. So those demonstrations that Amir just gave, that's them, for example. You can buy these tools. So I bought Incogni for myself. Just for awareness, I used a coupon code and I got a 1 year subscription. It was $77. And full disclosure, I personally bought that. And I put my name, email, a couple pieces of data, name, email, I think date of birth, in there and said go. And what it does is it goes to all these websites that it knows about that has your data. And in those T's and C's and privacy policies, if you look in the fine print, it often will tell you how to actually make a request to get them to delete your data. And it's often very challenging, but they've actually gone through and do the details. I'm not advocating for this particular one. I'm just telling you my personal experience.
Yeah.
It started going through and I was like, I don't know about this. It's listing a bunch of websites and things I've never even heard of. I was like, I don't know. And then it started hitting some of the bigger ones. So when I've done some OSINT presentations in the past, I would do the demos that Amir had done. The problem is it actually removed my stuff off those websites. So we had to use his stuff instead of mine because it didn't work anymore. So it
Interesting.
it actually is kind of working. I'm not saying it's foolproof, but
it's
we
something
couldn't
you
do
can
the demos to show you my data because it had removed it in the last week. So I screwed us up on that.
No, you're fine. But I mean, it shows that it does work, You just have to, even if it's meant to sort of cannibalize the data and cannibalize you, you have to still buy into it at a degree if you really want to disrupt that pattern. But there's also more like additional resources you can use that aren't as like time consuming, right? If you're a part of any of these groups, right, you can get like free fraud alerts and freeze options from things like Experian, Equifax, TransUnion. Like they're known as the big three when it comes to like these like credit reporting companies. But one thing to also mention is there is so much more than just that list of three. If you follow this link and it'll be posted, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of different companies for different fields. And all of these, in some way or shape, form, offer something of like a fraud alert or a freeze option that can be really invaluable, especially because a lot of these companies also offer something called, what is it called? Like a credit lock instead of a credit freeze. And it's in its simplest terms, it's a scam, really. Like getting your credit frozen is an actual, like, I think it's a federal regulate. They have to provide that like from the federal level. So when, let's say, Experian offers you to pay however much a year for a credit lock, it only works for Experian. It's not really as holistic as it makes it seem. It doesn't really protect you. It's just a way for them to gather your money. You want to add on that, Sammy?
People always talk about so anybody who's had a data breach, you can go into any one of those and submit, says I'm a fraud alert because I was in a data breach, and it will submit it to the other one.
Yeah.
People often hear about those three and they say the top three. Well, think about that phrase, top three. There are many other credit bureaus out there, and that's what that link, the image is shared. Like the fourth one is called Innovius. It's a fourth one, and then there are many others that have it. The Clue report, CLUE, that tracks your insurance stuff. You can request these reports, you can freeze these reports. It's not just those three. There are hundreds of these things. These are some of the things that I use personally. Like my family, we have AAA membership. Well, AAA membership gives me protect my ID, identity theft protection from Experian as part of my AAA membership. I have a credit card through the State Employees Credit Union. It's their Visa credit card. It comes with ID Navigator, which is from Norton LifeLock. So that comes with that. So you may actually have some extra identity monitoring and features and functions that are part of things that you just use every day. You may not have known that. Just letting you know that you don't necessarily have to pay for something to say there are things out there. So I have all of these. And by the way, I'm in the Breach of the Month Club. So I have Experian for life.
Yeah.
That's how I know about all these, because I'm in all of them.
And it's not these like just these private groups. Also, there's a lot of federal resources that Sammy's well familiar with. There's the Federal Privacy Council, the FTC. There's a lot. They have consumer.gov, identitytheft.gov, which it feels a bit funny that it's such a big issue that our federal government has to have a whole website just to go through the identity theft like kind of process if you're a victim of that. But make sure you're just aware of what's out there and what's available. Look at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and just really, it all boils down to making yourself aware and kind of taking advantage of the free resources and the paid ones, to just do your best to disrupt the cycle and protect yourself, protect your data. Because even though companies may say otherwise, they are really not out there to protect you specifically. You have to think about it as of where's this data going? What do they benefit from using your data? And really kind of think it from that holistic perspective.
When we post our recording for our session, we'll be sure to post all of these links and resources for folks too. I just want to say a big thank you to Amir and Sammy as we wrap up our webinar this afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and shedding some light, giving us some really great resources to help us better understand data breaches, data privacy, and how we can protect ourselves. Just thrilled to learn more from you and kind of understand that we're in this boat together. We're all trying to sort this out and figure it out, need to apply some common sense and pay attention to what's going on before we just happily agree to everything, and understanding that data is a currency as well. I know you folks have a webinar that's coming up tomorrow too, so we can drop that link into the chat for folks that might be interested in joining you. Be another fascinating conversation there if you want to share a little bit about that workshop that's coming up.
Yeah, just in short, Sammy is going to be leading as a part of the NCDPI K-12 cybersecurity program webinar series. It's going to be a workshop on Wireshark, network intrusion analysis with Wireshark. It's another free sort of open source tool focused on networking. And this will be a very technical deep dive. But if you are interested in the technical side and just want to kind of sit back and really be a fly on the wall to see, like when we say OSINT is really this big glacier that we didn't really touch on. Sammy is the guy to really take you into the deep end and show you not only how bad it can get in terms of the attacks, but what you can do using these tools to protect yourself and really sort of decipher this puzzle that is like data breaches and threat analysis.
We talk about data breaches, so I'm going to walk through. There's a server that was compromised, and we recorded the whole thing. And so I'm going to walk you through from a networking perspective what that looked and felt like. They're sniffing around that reconnaissance thing. They finally broke in. They downloaded some malware, and then they turned that server into a zombie and started attacking other systems. I'm going to walk you through in detail what that looks like. You can sit back and listen, you can participate, but that is tomorrow from 10 to 12, and let me drop the registration link into that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Really appreciate it. This was the third in our series for Real Issues, Real Data. Our next topic coming up in January or December, excuse me, is thinking about how do we broaden our STEM pathways. In January, we'll be talking about SEL in an AI world. So STEM in December and SEL and AI in January. So looking forward to having all of you join us for those events coming up. Stay tuned for more information and really appreciate all of you and your time this afternoon. Take care, everybody.